Good afternoon to those in Europe and good morning to those in Americas. We are now in the second session or afternoon session of the Colloquium on St Maximus Letters. For those who don't know, today we celebrate according to old style calendar St Maximus the Confessor. And we have this honor to have like five or four speakers, including me in this session, coming from like two from Athens and three from Americas. And we have a slight change in the program. Dionysius Skleris, who should be our first presenter, is at the moment busy with well, you probably heard that about the departure of our teacher, Metropolitan John Zizioulas, yesterday, and he's actually involved in organizing a funeral. And for this reason, we have a slight change in the program. First, who will speak is Father Panayotis Peter Hasiakos. He's coming from Eastmoreland. This is close to Chicago. He did his master with Father Maximus Constans, whom we all know, and he will be talking on the subject which is of our common interest, and this is a translation. He he translated Maximus Christological Letters, and it will be published in St. Vladimir's Seminary Press, and he will talk about this project. Father Panayotis, floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Vladimir, and greetings to everyone. And it's a privilege for me to be able to participate in this colloquium on St. Maximus's Letters. I'd like to thank the organizers for allowing me to participate and to offer something to share a little bit about some of the work that I've been able to do on these very interesting texts. My presentation today is entitled Translating the Christological Letters of St. Maximus the Confessor, letters 12 to 19. I'll begin by sharing a little bit about my work, what motivated me to undertake the project, and say a little bit about the content of the letters, though I know that there was a presentation earlier by George Siskos, which would have dealt with these themes in some detail, and I did benefit from his dissertation in my studies and in my work. Then I'll speak a little bit about the process of translating the letters into English, what it entailed, and some of the challenges. And then finally, I'll just say a brief word about the forthcoming publication and offer some concluding remarks. And I have my stopwatch going here so that I don't go too long. So first, my interest in these letters came about through just a more general interest in Orthodox Christology, both from a patristic and historical point of view, from Chalcedon through the Sixth Council, with all of those important developments in between. And the person of St. Max the Confessor is most often associated with the monoenergist and monothelite controversies, but I became intrigued when I learned and came into contact with these letters, which focused more squarely on his defense of the Chalcedonian doctrine of Christ's two natures. So it was in his early Christological engagement. I first stumbled upon letter 12 in 2014 and began translating it as an academic side project. And then in 2015, as Vladimir mentioned, I embarked on a thesis project, which aimed to produce an English translation of those letters, 12 to 19, along with a brief study. And so we could say that the translation was not an end in itself, but part of a larger goal of really discovering the theological content of these letters. And as I said, in these letters, Maximus is in the early stages of his involvement in the Christological controversy. Letters 12 to 19 are roughly dated from around the time of the Pact of Union at Alexandria in 633 until about 641 or 642, and that falls several years short of the dispute with Pyrrhus and Carthage. In these texts, Maximus is giving an exposition of Chalcedonian Diaphysite Christology in response to the Christology of Severus of Antioch. And there's interesting historical details in there about Deacon Cosmas, who comes from the non-Chalcedonian church into the imperial or the canonical church. Also a group of nuns who were under Severan bishops and came into the fold and then went back. So it is a very, also from a historical point of view, there is interesting material. Without going into detail, some of the themes that Maximus develops are the enduring presence of the two natures after the hypostatic union, that Christ is not a composite nature, but rather a composite hypostasis, the notion of difference, which does not, for Maximus, imply division, and number, which also does not create division, but rather indicates difference, and the relationship between names and realities. There are only a few minor gestures towards the notion of Christ's operations or activities, but these do not figure prominently. It is in Maximus's later work that he takes up the issue of monoenergism and monothelitism with full force. And so thus we can say that these letters in a way lay the groundwork for his later and more well-known Christological writings. So now I'll speak a little bit about the translation project itself. Currently, there's no complete translation of these letters, 12 to 19, available in English. There exists a French translation of the full corpus of letters by Emmanuel Ponsoye, Romanian by Father Dumitru Stăniloae, and a modern Greek one by Ignatius Sakalis. I have recently also learned that an English translation of the complete corpus of the letters is underway and expected to appear in the near future in the Catholic University of America Fathers of the Church series by Jordan Wood, and this will, of course, be an invaluable resource for the study of these letters. And moreover, since translation necessarily requires interpretation, especially for writers difficult as Maximus, we could benefit greatly from having more than one translation available. Having access to modern translations, and for me, primarily the modern Greek, as I'm not a fluent reader of French, was especially helpful to help to untangle long passages with complex syntax, since modern languages usually demand the translator to break these sentences down and make the reference of participles more explicit. In addition, a number of secondary sources were invaluable to me in understanding the theological and the philosophical concepts, of which there were many, and I feel in some ways I am only scratching the surface. These included, among others, the two annotated date lists of Maximus's works, first by Sherwood in 1952, and then more recently by Marek Jankowiak and Phil Booth in the Oxford Handbook of Maximus the Confessor in 2015. And some other important secondary articles and books which I cite in my bibliography. As for the Greek text, no published critical edition of the full corpus of Maximus' letters is currently available, though we most eagerly await the appearance of a full critical edition of the Epistolary Letters in Corpus Christianorum. Until then, we rely on the text established by Combefis in 1675, which was then, as listed in the description of our colloquium today, was reprinted in volume 91 of Migne's Patrologia Graeca. And letters 12 to 19, which I translated, comprise about 70 columns of Greek text in PG. So just to begin with the question of how dependable is the text in PG, I'll offer just a couple of comments without exhaustively trying to answer. In the introduction to his book, The Christocentric Cosmology of St Maximus the Confessor, Torsten Tallefsen notes that both Lars Thunberg and Father Andrew Luth feel a degree of confidence in Migne's text based on its comparison with critical editions of Maximus published thus far in Corpus Christianorum. And in a footnote in that same introduction, Tallefsen adds that Thunberg personally wrote to Polycarp Sherwood asking this very question, and that Sherwood in his reply said that to a great degree we can trust the PG text. In my own humble experience working on these 8 letters over the course of several years, I felt more or less the same way. I did. Can I be heard okay? Okay. I felt more or less the same way. However, I did feel the need to clarify or check the text occasionally during the course of the translation. And for this reason, I decided that this translation would be good to make it in consultation with at least a small number of manuscripts. In general, I've tried to have two, but at least one manuscript at my disposal for each letter. And again, the process of working with the manuscripts was more on the basis of need. It was a practical aspect of the translation process. It was not with the goal of producing any kind of even mildly critical text in any way, though I did keep notes on certain variants and adapt, used it to produce the translation accordingly. So the aim of these manuscripts was to not to produce critical text, but to feel more secure in translating the text wherever there were instances of confusing spelling, grammar, syntax, punctuation, or meaning. So the PG remained the primary text. I did compare the earlier printed Combefis edition just to see if there was any perhaps errors in transmission between the Combefis and the PG edition, and I did not really find instances of that. It seems that it was reproduced very faithfully. And so I will start a little, if I may, a little PowerPoint presentation with just some, let's see here, just with some images that may be interesting. And okay, can we see the image? Okay, wonderful. So this is a list of the manuscripts that I worked with, again, to varying degrees. These 7 manuscripts covered all of the letters, some of them more than one letter, and these were the ones that I was using. I just to give us kind of for fun to show the way to give the spirit of how I did my work, I thought maybe I would put a kind of case study, a little example on the screen. And so here I have an excerpt from letter 12. And I think it's kind of a representative example, kind of shows a little bit what it was like translating the letters, and also how the manuscripts helped. So I'm trying to fix my little thumbnail so that I can see. So here is a section in which Maximus is making reference, he's refuting the idea of a composite nature, that Christ is a composite nature, one of the ideas of Severus. And just kind of attacking the sentence, we see in the beginning, the first part, the thrust of the sentence, is the statement that no one would ever dare to say or to call Christ one composite nature. So there's the first part of the sentence, which goes pretty smoothly for a translator coming to the passage. Then we move to the second part of the sentence, and it begins with an ina clause, ina me, that he might not. And then our instinct is to look for a verb that would complete this phrase. And so we expect a subjunctive mood somewhere. As we go along, we don't find anything too quickly. We see a couple of participles, so we see a long sentence structure, as is very common in Maximus. But then towards the end, we do come to a verb, but it is not in the tense that I would expect. It's not in the subjunctive mood. It seems to be a future. We'll say a moment about that. So this is an instance where just kind of going through the text in the natural way, where I stop and I look at the manuscripts. I looked at several, and I'll just show you from one, just so you can have a look. This is from Barochianus Graecus 128, which is an 11th century manuscript, and which proved to be important in some other cases as well. So you see here the word katastisi. It appears in the form that Min has it printed with the epsilon iota, so what appears to be a future tense. But interestingly, above, we see what looks like an ita. It doesn't seem that there's anything around it that it could be punctuation that I'm mistaking, or it appears that there is another reading or another the letter that the scribe has placed there. Coming back to the text, this is a possible reading then, to look at the subjunctive mood there, the aorist subjunctive, and to see that as the kind of bringing the sentence together. And I'll give the full translation at the end. What was a little surprising is that in looking at 3 different manuscripts, all 3 of them had this form that was printed in the main text. And even the one that we just saw, the primary, or the first one that's given there is this one with the epsilon iota. But at least there seems to be some possibility for the form that we expect. And so is it possible that there's a precedent for the former? Since I'm not a philologist, I always humble myself and accept the possibility that, maybe it's not the way that I would expect. But nevertheless, as I said in the beginning, the purpose of using the manuscript is just to help me come to terms with the text. And so for me, this is a reading that makes the sentence come together and really helped the translation. I want to also mention that there was another instance, which we'll see, which Barocianus Graecus was the only one to offer a grammatically correct or the grammatically expected reading. So this is something that's happened more than once using this manuscript. So it seems like an important manuscript, and perhaps even though it's the minority in this case, perhaps it actually is the important reading to note. So we have the sentence, the long sentence is kind of all pieced together. We had a couple of participles. And the other interesting thing here is that just one of the things that tends to happen is these parenthetical statements that are blocked off by high stops. The more I worked with these letters, probably is the case with other texts of Maximus, you see how there are these strings of parenthetical statements, and we have to kind of see where is he going, where does it start, where does it end. And in the manuscripts where there's no modern punctuation, sometimes seeing how the scribes use the punctuation can be enlightening and help us think a little differently. So here I won't take too much time, but you can see kind of how it all comes together. Turns out I end up using the future tense anyways in the translation, just to make the sentences kind of work out. So again, that was just more to give a little taste of how I did my work and how I had recourse to the manuscripts when I encountered something maybe that I did not expect or I needed to understand a little better. One variant that seemed worth mentioning was kind of an interesting one is in letter 15, whereas the printed text had kenotitos, newness, the manuscripts had kenotitos, commonality. That's attested in 2 manuscripts. This one was an interesting one for someone also that reads modern Greek. This verb aphorizo, in 2 manuscripts, not only in the PG, but in 2 manuscripts, interestingly, it has this form where the prefix is augmented. And this is kind of a phenomenon that comes in more towards modern forms of Greek. It doesn't follow the classical kind of conjugation, but it surprised me that in 2 manuscripts, one from the 11th century and one from the 13th or 14th, that this kind of a form appeared. But then again, Barocianus Graecus came through and provided what was grammatically what we anticipated, and so I would elect that reading in that instance. So just an interesting kind of example. And then something else that has to do with the printed text and the manuscripts is that there was instances, especially this one, where Combefis supplied Greek words, those that are in brackets, to make sense of the text, and it was not attested in the manuscript that I checked, and yet I can't seem to get away from Combefis' suggestion. It just is so helpful, and it's hard to understand this passage. Speaking of in letter 19, it gets to these topics a little bit. For the divine and the human things come as from one and the same incarnate word of God, speaking of the divine and the human in the one Christ. So this is an instance where it's not on the basis of a manuscript, but just following Combefis, who obviously worked with the text in many manuscripts, his suggestion it seems to hold and to be very important. And I'll try not to go over too long here, and not to go over the 20 minutes. We have some singular and plural forms that appear in letter 12. So Maximus begins the letter with the plural theophylacti and speaks of as children. I exhort you as children, but then in the end ends with despotam eulogimene, and my blessed Lord. So we see a kind of combination of plural and singular forms. This is also noted in the Ambigua in one of the footnotes. And so it could be that Maximus anticipates plural readership. It could be that there is an imperial retinue to which he's referring. So in the translation, I have not gone to great lengths to try to rectify that or to account for it. And I just kind of go with it and allow it to appear in both ways. There are some other words, we may not have time to discuss them at length, but there is this, whether we think of it as a noun or a participle, ipokimena, ipokimenon. Ipokimenon, the singular occurs really only in about 2 places, but ipokimena a little more. And I've rendered it underlying in some cases, where it speaks about the natures or the realities. He calls them ta ipokimena pragmata. Again, perhaps there are other ways of translating, but Maximus does make use of this word when he's talking about ultimately the 2 natures of Christ, but he does it in subtle and more conceptual ways. And then ipokimenon itself seems like it's a word that has lots of connotations and some philosophical meaning when it's used in the singular. So definitely something for study and for consideration. And the last thing that I'll just mention is this kind of what we refer to as the tripartite formula. Sometimes Maximus gives all 3 pieces or just 2. The natures from which, in which, and which Christ is. In this really notable example, Maximus actually uses the feminine, and he says the natures, NS. In other cases, he speaks of the soul and body, and he uses, in that passage, the neuter. Sometimes we can't tell because the plural genitive does not reveal. And sometimes he speaks even in a neuter singular, the one and the other. And so this is kind of a feature of Maximus's Christological discourse. It reminds us a little bit of Gregory, the theologian, and kind of it shows us this way that Maximus is able to speak about things, on the one hand being cautious with terminology, on the other hand having kind of flexible way of speaking that helps us to think in a different way. Again. And so do we translate them natures? Do we translate them reality, elements? Probably all of them are possible. And there's arguments to be made for taking all different approaches. And that concludes the slideshow. And I'll just offer a couple of closing remarks. Now, just to say a brief word, as I promised, about the publication of the translation. My English translation of these letters, 12 to 19, is essentially complete and undergoing final stages of revision, along with a brief introduction to their content. The translation is forthcoming, as Vladimir mentioned, in St. Vladimir's Theological Seminary Press in the Popular Patristic series. This would have probably been published much sooner. However, I decided that it'd be beneficial to offer a Greek text that could be a facing page translation with the text, seeing that these are such technical passages. And so the Greek text will be basically the PG text with some minor emendations based on the manuscript work that I did. But again, this was by no means a critical edition or an exhaustive study of the manuscript, so I think it should be understood as the PG text with some minor corrections. To conclude, Maximus's letters 12 to 19 are rich in Christological content and give us a glimpse into the Chalcedonian theological mind of Maximus that would later become more well-known in the monoenegist and monothelite controversies. In addition to the importance of their content, the increasing body of secondary literature related to them, along with the anticipation of a critical edition and translations, make them an exciting area of study, together with that of the Opuscula, which was the subject of this colloquium in 2020. It is my hope that the work that I have shared with you today may provide a humble contribution for others who are interested in these texts and in studying Maximus's Christology more generally. Though practically this project is nearing completion, for me, the study of the content has just begun. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Panayotis, very much indeed. Now it's we open the floor for questions. You can, well, I see the gallery. I don't see the hands, but be totally free to unmute yourself and to pose the question. And I will start first. Well, I'm not the one who is very familiar with translation and work on manuscripts, but when you mentioned, Father Panayotis, that Maximus is very free with using grammatical genders, I'm thinking about of his sort of gender theology. You probably know this chapters when he's talking about overcoming sexes, and he sometimes using a neuter to in order to actually explain. Is this particularly the case in the examples? You probably just gave few, but maybe you have more, that he's deliberately using this, or you think that this is some kind of mistake, or I don't know what else can be. Thank you.
Thank you. I think maybe a couple things come to mind, and I don't know how well they will answer. The first is that, as I might have alluded to, I think Maximus, in my introduction, I say a word about kind of his methodology, how he is making his argument for Chalcedon. With, interestingly, and I don't know if I said this, I think I skipped over it for time. He never, in these letters, invokes the authority of the Council of Chalcedon. He makes a reference to the fathers. Interestingly, too, Gregory, Basil, Cyril. So he's also making reference to pre-Chalcedonian fathers. So a conjecture might be that Maximus wants to show the truth of Chalcedonian Christology without being bound to just citing the authority or the exact formulations. We know that, for example, Cyril of Alexandria, who is obviously the interpretation of Cyril, is such a big topic in all of this. And we see Cyril too, even prior to the kind of formalization of the terminology at Chalcedon, he's able to kind of gesture towards even the natures, and the same with Gregory the Theologian, as I said, without necessarily having the word feces, the feminine word, locked into place by that conciliar authority. So my kind of instinctual way that I understood his use of the neuter, for example, it was just a way of kind of speaking about the concept, and perhaps Maximus, and again, I can't say for sure, but perhaps for someone that we see instances of people in the non-Chalcedonian kind of church there, that he's presumably speaking to people that may not respect the authority of the council. Perhaps Maximus wants to speak in kind of different types of ways just to convey the concept without being beholden to the authority, the issue of authority. The other thing that is also just probably worth mentioning is that there is in letter 15 this theme, and I think it's only in 15, of Christ as the mediator, which goes with those texts that we're just speaking about. And that's an area that I would like to understand a lot more, because there's this speaking of Christ, his parts are his natures, but then it speaks of the extremes, the akra, and he unites his parts with the extremes. And again, these are neuter plurals. There's this interplay of parts, whole, nature. So that little section on the mediator and all the things about the hypostasis in letter 15 are, I think, a very rich area. And there could be lots of insights and connections there that maybe we haven't scratched the surface of, or at least I haven't.
Great, thank you. Questions? Nicholas, or yes, please. Just unmute yourself, please. Oh, okay.
Just one thing. Congratulations to letter 20 into Hungarian and it is. Can you hear me?
We can hear, but it's kind of a little bit choppy.
Maybe you could just write the question, and we'll see. We'll all see it, and then Father Panayotis could answer.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. I was excited.
Okay. If there is no more questions, or okay, if there is no more questions, we move on. The next speaker today is Dionysius Cleris from Athens. There is no need to introduce Dionysius. He's many years in Maximian studies. He is a big authority, having written his degree and several books, but I'm sure that it will be more. Dionysius is affiliated to Hellenic Open University, working in the Greek Parliament, and now he will present his paper on the topic, the notion of love in the letter St Maximus the Confessor. Please, Dionysius.
Thank you so much, dear Vladimir. I dedicate my speech to the sacred memory of His Eminence John of Pergamon's Ioulas, who has passed away yesterday due to COVID complications. So I would like to share with you some thoughts that I have heard from him, and during our discussions, he was insisting on the topic of love. What is the character of love in St Maximus the Confessor, especially in the second letter, but also in some other letters. And I would like to share with you some thoughts that I have heard of from him, and we have been discussing them. And also, of course, some my own paper, which is also based in the bibliography on the matter by Irene Hausherr and also the other great Maximian scholars. So what is interesting about love in St. Maximus is that it can have two opposites. On the one hand, the opposite of love is hate, and on the other hand, the opposite of love is egoism, philautia. And I think that we can also find this element in, do you hear me well? Ah, good, good. So we can find that in the classical book by Irene Hausherr. And the distinction between the two is the following. There is a narrower sense of love in the when it is considered as the specific virtue of the irascible part of the soul, the virtue of the thymos, the thymikon. And in this case, love is seen as a leap out of the vicious circle of anger, wrath, and sorrow, oργή, θλίψη. As you all know, there is the famous vicious circle between pleasure and pain, but there's also, this considers mostly the element of desire, but there is also a second vicious circle in the irascible part of the soul, and this is the vicious circle between sorrow and wrath. Wrath is the equivalent of lust and pleasure, whereas sorrow is the equivalent of pain. And the meaning is that in the fallen world, man tries to overcome sorrow through anger. And this leads to a vicious circle in which every new expression of wrath and anger has sorrow as its debt, so to speak, as every pleasure has pain as its death. And love is a virtue that comes as a leap out of this vicious circle through grace. This is the narrower sense. At the same time, especially in letter 2, we have a wider sense of love in which it is seen as the unique principle or results of all virtues. And in this case, the opposite of love is not something specific as anger, wrath, or hate, which are specific feelings for fellow men, because the irascible part of the soul is directed to fellow men and women. So the wider sense of love in the second epistula is love as the ontological principle of all virtues, its opposite being egoism, philautia. Especially in, I will quote the letter 2 in the Patrologia Graeca, it is 387d to 400b. And in this passage, we find that egoism, philautia, is a principle of all vices. So if we remove egoism, we remove automatically all traces of vice. So even though the moral teaching of St. Maximus is very analytical in some passages, it is also very synthetic in its depth. St. Maximus regards the unity of all vices in egoism, which is tantamount to considering ourselves as the absolute point of reference. And inversely, St. Maximus is viewing a unity of all virtues in love, which consists in the choice of otherness as the point of reference. Love has the duty to collect all the fragmentary beings after the fall, and to institute thespizin man to a unique, unitary logos and tropos in St. Maximus terms. So love has the rational function, logική λειτουργία, that is to highlight and to exalt the unique logos of being, which is overshadowed by the fragmentation caused by egoism. I would like to remind you that we have the theory of logoi of beings, as you all know, and the principal etymological meaning of logos, which is reflected in St. Maximus' theory, is to collect. And by the way, of course, as you know, lego in Latin means to collect. And also even the English term to collect comes from colligo, con and lego. So the lego in Greek can also mean to say, to speak, but its basic etymological meaning that is reflected in this philosophy is to collect. This means that the rational capacity is a capacity to collect and to form one unitary principle out of all the heterogeneity of sensible experience. And when we speak about logos, this logos has one interior and the athetos, one interior aspect. This interior aspect is to collect. Actually, there is a double movement from the intellect to the logos, and from the Father to the Son, the Trinitarian theology in the Spirit. And also there is a reversion from the world to the Son in the Spirit, and then to the Father, or to the logos, and then to the intellect. The intellect is unitary, but it is very simple. The logos, the principle of logos, is a collection that in the point of reversion, it leads to the simplicity of the intellect through collecting what is unitary. Whereas in the opposite movement from the Father to the world, logos is an expression. So love has the ontological function of bringing the world together in the Logos, which is tantamount to Christ in St. Maximus' Christology. We have this synthesis of Neoplatonism and Christology. And so we have this logical function of love, but we also have the expression unique tropos, mode of a mode. We can understand the term mode here in a moral sense, and in this sense, the unique mode would mean a moral and ethical singularity, but it can also be understood ontologically as a coincidence of a mode with the logos of being. That is a moral and ethical mode that is identical to the logos of Christ and to this unity which transcends fragmentation. What is interesting in this letter, in this passage, is that this union provoked by love and which is tantamount to the bringing together of humanity in the Logos that is Christ. So this union is not seen as a complete equality, but on the contrary, as a laudable inequality in which every person will give to his or her fellow person more importance than to him or herself. So this is not an abstract equality, but it is an imitation of the sacrifice of Christ. This imitation leads to the abolition of the fragmentation of the gnomic will and to the reunion with the simplicity and identity of the expressed logos of existence. This is, as I said, there is this dual movement of exterior movement and interior movement of reversion. In the exterior movement, the intellect is the father in the Trinitarian economical theology. The Father, as the first principle of unity, begets the Son, who is tantamount to reason, to logos, in the eternal Trinity. But in the economical Trinity, this means the creation of the world, which has the incarnation of the Son as its goal, as its reason of existence. And this, of course, happens in the Spirit. The reversion movement is that after the incarnation and the resurrection of Christ, we have the collection of all beings and their union in the Logos, in the incarnated Logos, which is then referred to the Christ as intellect in the Spirit. This is the meaning of Logos in St. Maximus, and so Logos has these two aspects. The one aspect is the aspect of the exterior movement, which is an aspect of expression and incarnation, and is something similar to what in human psychology is speech. And the other movement of reversion is the movement of collection, which in human psychology is tantamount to what one could perceive as bringing together, thanks to speech, forms that are then referred to the intellect. Of course, this could be seen as too anthropomorphic, but we have to say that St. Maximus tries to integrate a sort of Neoplatonist psychology with Christology. And in doing that, he's also shifting and changing Neoplatonism in order to fit to biblical and Christological theology. For example, to give one small example, in Neoplatonism, the simplicity is found in the one, whereas the aspect of Logos is a lower aspect of creation. On the contrary, in St. Maximus, the simplicity is found not in the one, because there is no complete simplicity without Trinity and without multiplicity. But the one is the Father, who is also the intellect. So the simplicity is found in the intellect, whereas the Logos is not something inferior, but it is an equal hypostasis to the Father, and also a hypostasis which is second only in matter of causality and not of equality of substance. So these are some of many differences of St. Maximus with Neoplatonism. I say all this in order to express that love is seeing as realizing this movement of reversion. This is the aspect of Logos. There's also the aspect of Tropos, which is the aspect of ethical realization of this unity through our deeds, through our action and acts. And this means an overcoming of the gnomic will in this second letter, as the logical movement of union evolves from the gnomic will to the natural will, and from the natural will to the Logos. This means that the divided moral, ethical, and gnomic cognitive dispositions, which are tantamount to some individual itineraries of the different human persons, are coordinated, and thus we achieve the union of nature as the manifestation of the logical unity. The Logos, that is Christ, thus refers this unity to God as its principle, as its cause. In general, St. Maximus highlights the fact that egoism is the cause, the basic cause of removing this movement of reversion and leading humanity and the world to an infinite fragmentation and division. Whereas after the fall, love has the function to annul this movement of fragmentation and division, and to be the principle of all virtues as the principle of union. In the passage 396c to D in the Migne Patrology, in the Epistle 2, St. Maximus writes that love is convincing the gnomic will, pithy. And it is a sort of convincing that the goal of this convincing is to stop the rebellion against the logical principle of nature. The Logos thus means the unity of nature, which means a unity of will and of the willing and the cognitive disposition. And here this unity is natural, but the nature cannot achieve this unity without grace. St. Maximus is stating that it is impossible to achieve the coordination of the gnomic dispositions of men if they are not primarily united to God. So we achieve our intersubjectivity, as phenomenology would say, this as, or the homognomosini, as St. Maximus would put it, that is the coordination of the gnomic wills, only through the union with God. And this is a point that I owe to His Eminence Bishop John, is that in order to achieve the unity of nature, then this unity of nature can only be achieved through the law of supernatural grace, nomos tis charitos, the hyperphysin. And here there is also a space for the element of eros, which is the divine eros is the virtue of the desiring part of the soul, according to St. Maximus. So the divine eros is the virtue of the desiring part of the soul, whereas love is the virtue of the irascible part of the soul. The function of eros is a sort of desiring intensity of longing for this unity of nature, whereas love is something similar, but as one would say, a calmer and more and deeper longing for this unity. The divine eros gives the element of intensity, as it is stated in another passage, eros estia agapi metepitaseos. Eros is love with intensity, whereas love is something calmer and more ontological. I see I have a few minutes left, so I will be more precise. And this double movement that we find in this has to do with the three capacities of the soul, that is logos, and logos, the irascible part, and desire. The opposite of logos is the lack of knowledge of God, and this leads to the selfish desire and to the tyranny toward fellow persons. This movement of desire can be reversed only through a correct use of the capacities, and of course all these passages have to be read together with the chapters on love, in which, as I said before, in the chapters on love, we find the more specific meaning of love as the virtue of the irascible part of the soul, whereas here we have the wider meaning. What is very important in, among other things, what's very important in letter 2 is the complete valorization of desire. That is a very interesting transformation of Platonist psychology. Desire is not the restless horse as in Plato. Desire is one very fundamental movement that can lead man and to God. I have also already spoken about the character of love as the virtue of the irascible soul, and this movement of reversion ends to the love of God that is realized in the hypostatic union, of the two natures in Christ. And excuse me one moment. And the conclusion of the letter is the epistle of John, that where we find the definition that God is love. St. Maximus wants to conclude his letter on love in this way in order to show that love is a supernatural divine reality. And so love is something that the human created nature strives for, but it cannot complete it through its own means. And we also have a reference to the works of God, that these are the realities around God. So in this sense, love is what unites man to the works of God, in which in the Palamite tradition is later called the energies, the acts of God, energia. There is a sort of vacillation if love should be termed as movement or as volition. And this is a dialogue of, and I conclude with that. This is a dialogue of St. Maximus with Aristotle. As you all know, in Aristotle, the God is totally immovable. He cannot be moved. And because being immovable is the absolute perfection, here St. Maximus in this letter speaks after the Areopagitic writings about a possibility of God himself to be moved toward the world through love. So in a sort of Maximian apophatic language, we found love as the movement of God who is immovable according to his metaphysical properties. So love is a sort of transcendence of the metaphysics properties of God himself. Thank you very much for your attention.
Yes, we are going to be special work.
Thank you very much, dear Dionysia, for great paper. Well, that's love from every aspect. Now the questions, please.
Who's all right? Oh, roll number 208. Okay, thank you.
Okay. Father Panayotis.
I wasn't sure how to raise my hand on the app. Thank you very much. And I was wondering, I wrote down a note. There was the synthesis of Neoplatonism and Christology. Could you maybe say a word about that, or just what the connection was you said between Neoplatonism and Christology?
So the question is about Neoplatonism and Christology. Yes. In Neoplatonism, as you know, we have a trinity in Plotinus of the one, the intellect, and the soul. Whereas the Christian Trinity is the Father, the Son, and the Spirit. St. Maximus is following an Alexandrinian tradition that is traced even to Philo of Alexandria, but it is then transformed time and time again by the great figures including St. Cyril, St. Athanasius, and the Cappadocians. So the difference is the following. The intellect, which occupies the second place in the Neoplatonist Trinity, in the Christian Trinity, it occupies the first place. I say this a little bit too schematically, but for reasons of brevity. And the Logos, which in Plotinus occupies the third position, in St. Maximus occupies the second position, that is the Son. And the third is the Spirit and not the soul. This has, what are the implications? Simplicity, the notion of the intellect is tantamount to simplicity, and this has experiential importance because it is related to the intellectual prayer. So, as the Father is the first in the first hypostasis in the economical Trinity, the Father is the first cause of the creation and the economy, and the protractiki atia, as St. Gregory Palamas would put it. And in this sense, he is tantamount to total simplicity, whereas the most important is that the second hypostasis, the Son, is a hypostasis of expression, of total expression. This is not seen as an intellectual expression as in Neoplatonism. It is seen as an utterance, as a speech act, one would say, following Austin. This is a biblical element. The Logos is not something in the mind. The creation is not something in the mind. The creation is something like a logical utterance, like a speech act, like in the Bible, in Genesis. This is a biblical difference from Neoplatonism. And the Christian difference, which is the main difference, the most important of all, is that this speech act is concretized through the incarnation. So we also have a total valorization of the body. And here we don't have a sort of hierarchy, a vertical hierarchy. We have the creation and the body inside the second hypostasis itself. So the spirit then has let's say the economical mission of the teleos, of the eschatological fulfillment. Yes, I would conclude here for reasons of brevity.
Thank you very much, dear Dionysius. Is there any more short question? Okay, if no, we go further on. And now it should be Sotiris Mitralexis in the program, but he told, since he is like Dionysius working for Greek Parliament, it might be some duties, and then I will jump in now, and then if Sotiris is coming later, he will give his paper. Well, my presentation is on the topic which is in some sense connected with departed Metropolitan, because in the let's say early 90s, when he became one of the biggest name in Orthodox theology in Serbia, but not just in Serbia, the question of the soul, immortality and mortality of the soul was one asked by many. And I tried to, after many years, to give an answer to this question. I will just, can you see my presentation? Okay. Well, the question of the unity between the body and the soul before, during, and after the earthly life captured the minds of many Byzantine Christians on the threshold between the 6th and the 7th century. For centuries, dominant Origenist view on this issue was not only condemned by the Fifth Ecumenical Council in 553, but it also provoked reaction of anti-Platonic intellectual stream that looked on these issues in more Aristotelian and materialistic fashion. The Christian intellectuals of the time, including Maximus the Confessor, had to formulate the doctrine on body and soul, being equally aware of the scylla of blatant Origenism and Charybdis of vulgar anti-Origenism. In this paper, I argue that although Maximus attacks the Origenist position of the pre-existence of the soul, he argues for the soul's self-sufficiency in afterlife, a position maintained by the Origenist. In the course of this paper, I will compare Maximus' position about the destiny of the soul post-mortem with the position of Stoic philosophers, and particularly Chrysippus on this issue. Since Maximus refused the preexistence of soul and thus adopts anti-Origenist position, thus he comes closer to Aristotelian and Stoic stance. Aristotelian influence on Maximus in regard to reciprocal relations and simultaneity of body and soul is obvious from Ambiguum 10. However, Maximus clearly disagrees with an Aristotelian sense that the soul is reduced to the function of the body, because the acceptance of such a stance implies the sleep of the souls in the period after that Maximus argues against. When it comes to the Stoic influence, Maximus is clearly against the Stoic position that soul is a corporeal reality. His Epistle 6 is written against those who, in order to emphasize divine incorporeality, had thought of soul's material nature. While in first 4 relatively short sections of the letter, Maximus argues about the difference between the soul and corporeal nature. In the 5th and the last section, he develops his argument by comparing the soul with God. Maximus admits that contrary to To God, who is immovable, the soul is movable, but the unceasing movement of the soul towards the good is nothing else than a natural act carried out for the same reason for which and by which the soul was created. The unceasing movement of the soul is a pledge of ever-moving repose of creation. Although Maximus refutes the Stoic idea of the corporeality and materiality of the soul, for him, like for Chrysippus, a personal identity is a compound of a body and a soul. Moreover, for him, like for Chrysippus, the death is a separation of soul from body. Stoics differ among themselves in their view on the post-mortem destiny of the soul. For some Stoics, that is the perishing of both body and soul, while for others, including Chrysippus, that is separation of the body and the soul. Those who teaches about the separation of body and soul and not about their perishing in the moments of death disagree on whether A, the soul continues to exist for some time, or B, soul exists for eternity. Eusebius of Caesarea writes that Stoics maintain that human beings survive as souls separated from bodies, being changed into the lesser substance of the soul, while the souls of non-rational animals perish along with their bodies. Since for Cleanthes, an identity of a person is grounded in the soul alone, then all deceased human beings continue to live as rational human souls until the end of the world cycle. For Chrysippus, the personal identity is grounded in the union of the soul and body, or embodied soul. Thus, the personal identity is lost after separation of soul from body. Nevertheless, according to Chrysippus, the souls of ordinary people could exist after that for some time, but they perish before the end of the world cycles, while the souls of wise people may last until the end of the world cycle. Cleanthes' position is similar to the position of Origenists, for whom personal identity is grounded in the rational soul, and the rational soul exists post-mortem in the same capacity like it existed before it entered the body. If the end of the world cycle is identified with the parousia, or the day of universal resurrection in the Christian tradition, then all the rational souls will last until parousia. As Maximus shares with Chrysippus the views on personal identity as grounded in the embodied soul, and on that as end of personal identity, it remains a question about the destiny of soul after death. Do souls perish in Maximus sometimes after the separation with the body, like in Chrysippus, or do souls of the wise people continue their existence until parousia? In order to answer this question, one needs to recall the doctrines about the life of the soul post-mortem that were dominant in Byzantium at the end of the 6th and the beginning of the 7th century. There were two dominant views on the state of the soul post-mortem. In accordance to the one view, the souls after that lapse in the state of psychomotor lethargy and cognitive oblivion, or even perish with the body, waiting to be returned to existence and united with the body by God on the day of resurrection. The first state of oblivion and lethargy of the soul after death, usually referred as the sleep of the soul, could be detected in Syrian writings as Abfrahat, Ephraim the Syrian, and Arsaionazibis, while the second state of the soul, known as that of the souls, Netopsisism, was a view spread among Arabic Christians and proclaimed as a heresy by John Damascene. The second view about the afterlife of the soul was predominant in Byzantium and adopted some elements of popular Greek religion and astrology, presuppose the soul ascent through a series of planetary spheres or so-called aerial toll gates, where its moral deeds interrogated by demons and defended by angels. This view was widespread in monastic hagiographies and found in authors such as Diadochus of Photike and Theophilus of Antioch. The problem with both views is that neither of them convincingly explains how it is possible that the souls of dead saints interfere in the affairs of the living Christians. The explanation of the earthly appearances of the departed saints was especially problematic for those maintaining the view of sleep or death of the souls, forcing them to argue that these appearances has no connection with the departed saints and that are phantasms produced by divine power. By the end of the 6th century, Eustathius of Constantinople produced a book on the state of souls after death, arguing against those who hold a view about the inactivity of the soul after death. Eustathius claims that by being simple, intelligible, noetic, incorporeal, and ever-moving, human souls can exist independently of the body and to be active after death. Moreover, the human souls, according to Eustathius, remain active only by virtue of synergy with divine, and only in this synergy they can be considered as self-subsistent personhood, as an hypostasized realities. At 3 decades after Eustathius, Maximus had to combat against the same opponents who argued about the inactivity of the soul after death. In his Epistle 7, written probably in 628, together with Epistle 6 and Ambigua ad Ioannem, Maximus claims that the soul did not lose neither of its faculties after death. He produces a lengthy train of arguments about the properties or faculties of the soul. Maximus argues that every nature is defined by its own properties, and if it loses the properties of which its essence consists, it will be impossible to speak of its existence. He further states that this is also applicable to human soul, which will cease to exist if it is stripped of its essential properties of mind and reason. Finally, Maximus concludes in the same vein like Eustathius, arguing that if the soul is intelligible, incorporeal, ever-moving, why should be deprived after the death of the body of the abilities inherent to it by nature and not appropriated from the body? While in Ambiguum 10, Maximus mentions the faculties of mind, reason, and sensation as essential to the nature of the soul, here in Epistle 7, he only refers to the faculty of mind and reason. Maximus offers a good explanation about the faculty of sensation in his Ambiguum 21. Quote, "Some have even called senses paradigmatic images of the powers of the soul, since, according to a certain mystical principle, every sense, along with its respective organ, that is, its organ of sense perception, has been given primordially and naturally analogous power of the soul. The sense of sight or the eye is the image of the mind, hearing or ear is the symbol of reason, smell or the nose is a symbol of anger, taste is the symbol of desire, the touch symbolizes the power of life," end of quote. Since the power of sensation is exercised by the bodily senses, it is rather a faculty of the body than the faculty of the soul. However, the faculty of sensation does not play only the positive role by supplying mind and reason with the impressions of sensible things, which transform by reason into simple spiritual principles or logoi or logi or sensible things and unified by the mind lead the soul further to God, but it plays also a negative role. The bodily faculty of sensation or sense perception can also distract mind and deviate it from its natural motion towards God. Maximus identifies sensation with a veil which confines the souls to surface appearances and deviate it from its way to intelligible reality. The consequence of the redirection of soul's intellectual and reasoning capacities from the intelligible to the sensible realm is the confinement of the soul to the sensible world and its oblivion for the intelligible world. The relations to a human soul established during its earthly life are enforced in its life after death. Those human souls which properly exercise their natural faculties and are by power of mind and reason transferred from sensible over intelligible realm to God will continue their life by clinging with its mind to God until the day of resurrection. Those human souls, which already during their earthly life have replaced the natural movement of mind and reason toward God with a natural movement of mind and reason toward the sensible world, due to the loss of sensible realm, will fall into oblivion and lethargy. In spite of the fact that the essential properties of their souls, namely mind and reason, are still preserved, they are incapacitated by being directed not toward God, but towards the world of senses. It will not be difficult to draw a parallel between Cleanthes and Chrysippus on one hand, and Maximus and his originistic opponents on the other hand. Although Cleanthes and Maximus' originist opponents took a diametrically opposite stances in answering the question whether the nature of the soul is corporeal or intelligible, they have few things in common. For both parties, a personal identity is grounded in the rational soul. This means that after the departure from body, a rational soul continues to live until the end of the world cycles, in case of Stoics, or until the day of resurrection, in case of Origenist or Chalcedonian Christians. Chrysippus' position may equally be compared with the position of Maximus, but also with the position of his anti-Origenistic opponents. Both Chrysippus and Maximus' anti-Origenistic opponents hold that the death is separation of the body and soul, and that the soul either perishes immediately after to separation from the body, or it continues to exist in an oblivious or comatose state until the next world cycle or until the day of universal resurrection. The difference between the death of the soul and the sleep of the soul post-mortem, the difference of the soul post-mortem, or reflect rather difference in responses of local Christian traditions of different religious background to Origenism than disagreement within one tradition about the level of independence which soul will retain after the separation from the body. The view on the sleep of the soul was widely spread among Byzantine Christians at the beginning of the 17th century, than the alternative view of the death of the soul. Finally, Chrysippus and Maximus have more things in common than Chrysippus and anti-Origenists. First, both authors consider death as separation of body and soul to be the destruction of personal identity, because the personal identity is not grounded in the rational soul, but in the human compound of body and soul. Second, Both authors allow possibility of human soul to survive the separation from body and continue its life in full or limited capacity. For Chrysippus, the souls of ordinary people will continue to live for some time after that, and the souls of wise people will live until the end of the world cycles. Maximus draws a similar differentiation between those who naturally exercise their intellectual and reasoning capacities, directing them towards God, and those who directed the essential faculties of every soul, mind, and reason towards the sensible realm or contrary to its nature. The soul of the former continued their life until the parousia by being fully pervaded by God as the object of their desire during their earthly life, while the souls of the latter, being incapacitated to achieve the sensible world as the object of their desire during their earthly life, fell into the lethargy and oblivion. In conclusion, contrary to both Origenists and moderate Chalcedonians, Maximus argues against the preexistence either of the soul or of the body, and for their simultaneous coming to existence. Similarly, he argues against the Origenist stance of the soul's self-sufficiency in afterlives, and against the Chalcedonian stance of the comatose state of the soul in afterlife. In this respect, Maximus is close to the Stoic position of Chrysippus. For Maximus, like for Chrysippus, the state of the soul in afterlife depends on the direction that the soul took in earthly life. If human beings naturally exercise their intellectual and reasoning capacities, directing them towards God, their souls will be fully functional in post-mortem. If, however, the human beings directed their mind and reason toward the sensible realm in their earthly life, their soul will be fully or partially incapacitated. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks. Now if there is a question for, okay, yes, please. Just unmute yourself.
Okay. So, Vladimir, I just have one question for you. This Maximus teaching about soul, how is connected with his, let's say, his theological system? For me personally, it's look like it's not very well connected about his Christology, especially his soteriology. It seems to me that he just, I don't know, want to defend some opinion that he found or think that is part of church tradition. Or maybe you see some, why this immortality of the soul, why it is important for salvation? Because it seems to me that his understanding of salvation can function very good even without all this soul story.
Yeah, I agree totally with you. It's not important because salvation is granted by God. It's by grace of God. It means that those people who either have whose soul is fully functional, and those people whose souls are incapacitated after death, they have the same possibility to be saved. That's at the end something that it's up to God. But I think that he was capturing the debate, and that that he was, of course, in many cases, what we said today, when thinking about Origenism, that Origenism, quite evolved from the 6th to 7th century. In 6th century, all these themes, which I mentioned before, and especially the beginning of the 6th century, were quite acceptable and quite widespread. With the condemnation and with the council, and by the end of the 6th century, things changed drastically. That then kind of vulgar anti-Origenists took, and then I started to actually to teach this doctrine, which actually was that the soul is not at all functional after that. It means that even as I mentioned in Arab Christianity, the soul is also dead after like a death of the body. And I think that Maximus actually, he took a position which at the beginning of the 6th century might be considered not even Origenists, because it was a common position, but when at the beginning of 7th century, it was a quite Origen's position, because for this. Now, I'm giving the historical view on this. Now, I agree with you completely that this question is not of kind of great importance, but the question is if you think universally about this topic, then how to justify the prayers to the saints, which was the main issue. Is the saints are dead? If their souls are dead, why we are praying to the saints? And I think that this was kind of the main issue for the debate. Oh my God.
May I interject for a moment?
Yes.
I'm very sorry.
Please.
Hello, Vladimir.
Well, I'm your like a replacement because you were not in time. I haven't seen you that you.
Oh no, I entered at 6.
Oh, sorry.
The issue is that I have a problem because 12 people will storm the offices at 1:45. So could we perhaps move the Q&A to 1:45 so that a brief version of my paper could be presented? There was a reason for the 6 to 6.
Okay, no problem. Just to ask
slot.
Luis, is it okay for you if you do the... Okay, then Sotiris, because Sotiris, I think that it's better to hear Sotiris, because Sotiris is also having a paper of Epistle 6, and actually we are staying together in the topic. Well, there is no need to present Sotiris. He's many years in Maximian studies, like the doctorate in Maximus, many books in St Maximus, many conferences organized in St Maximus. Please, Sotiris, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Vladimir. I apologize profusely for being a bit brief today. It's due to that, to the situation that changed and the office chores here. So, some notes on Maximus on the soul in Epistle 6. First of all, Maximus and the soul. What is the soul? A quick survey of Maximian literature would point to a short text, Peri Psychis Opusculum de Anima, as an entry point. Apart from the PG, Patrologia Graeca, this was also published in Cantarella's edition of the Mystagogia and other writings. Thankfully, we now know that this text has not been penned by Maximus, because there's quite a few problems with that particular text. The attribution to Maximus is an erroneous one, as has been proven by Francesco Celia in 2011 in a journal article at Adamantius. And the definition of the soul therein has caused quite some confusion to Maximus scholars, not being aware of the attribution, of the erroneous attribution. Yet among many sources in Maximus's actual writings, there is indeed a short text penned by Maximus and dedicated to the soul, both Epistles 6 and 7, with about which Vladimir spoke. Now, the 6th epistle is a multifaceted argument in favor of the incorporeality of the soul. As Maximus writes, I cannot but accept your offer to prove whether the soul is an incorporeal creature, being based in evidence from nature, Maximus says, without considering the witness of the scriptures and the fathers. So Maximus would not invoke here, would engender more of a philosophical argument, of a purely philosophical argument, if you'd like, rather than simply invoking, you know, the gravitas of fathers or scriptures or even tradition. Now, one might be excused to think that patristic tradition either way affirms the incorporeality and immateriality of the soul, yet this is not so. Just to cite an example, Nikolaos Ludovicos challenges such an assertion from a patristic perspective and brings a number of objections from the fathers and from tradition, objections to the total immateriality of the soul on the table, opting for the soul being a most subtle body, or a most subtle body in a 2006 book in Greek. The collection of patristic sources is quite startling for such a claim. But let us return to Maximus in his Epistle 6, to the most saintly and blessed Archbishop John on the corporeality of the soul. I'm aided here by an unpublished translation, unpublished and brave translation by Dionysius Clearys into English. The confessor commences with a fivefold argument on the it's my stress, my time-induced stress, on the subject of the title, with an argumentum ad absurdum in particular. He says, if the body, and I quote now, if the body is motionless by its own nature, and if the soul is a body, even if it is the subtlest of bodies, as they claim, then the soul will not be able to move due to its being a body. Whence does motion come? And this can go ad infinitum until one reaches the incorporeal nature. And so the idea here is that a body is not moved by itself. It is moved by something else, etc. But the soul is a moving agent. And Maximus continues, and if they claim that we are firstly moved by God, comment here meaning that it is not necessary that the soul moves things such as the body, then since most of our movements are unreasonable and vile, they will be forced to say that the divine is necessarily the cause of such movements too. So this is an argument that the soul itself initiates motion, and that you cannot explain that away, explain a bodily, a corporeal soul away by simply saying that, oh, all motion derives from God either way, etc., etc., etc. So here, in contrast to other passages, Maximus seems to also be not very content with a prime mover, as it were, idea, in spite of the fact that obviously the soul, as well as everything else, is indeed created by God. The second argument is that every corporeal existence is necessarily divided, according to the Logos, in quantity and quality, volume and form, in surface and shape, etc., etc., etc. And whoever is investigating about it will not be able to imagine something apart from them, from those boundaries, etc. But if the soul is a body, then it either necessarily derives from them, or is identical to them, or to some of them, or to one of them, or the soul is describable by them, or some of them, or none of them, or one of them. And Maximus then asserts and underscores that no, this cannot be the case. The soul being simple, it is not derived, not identical, cannot be divided in such ways, etc. And hence the soul is not a body. It's not the strongest of Maximus's argument here. Now, there is the third argument, which is slightly more interesting. Either way, these arguments are of a climactic nature in terms of how interesting they are, both philosophically and theologically. Maximus says in the third argument, if there is no controversy about the existence of the soul, if we all agree that there is indeed a soul, and even though it does exist, it is none of these realities that the conception can grasp, through which exist the bodies, or which are identical to the bodies, such as color, shape, mass or resistance of mass, more properly, antitypia in Greek, weight, quantity, three-dimensionality, etc. And if in general it is none of these realities that we conceive in relation to the corporeal nature, then the reality, which is none of the aforementioned, as our argumentation has shown, will necessarily be incorporeal if it exists in the first place. So this is an argument that is contingent on every interlocutor agreeing that there is indeed a soul, as it were. Now, the fourth argument is an argument in which Maximus, in a certain sense, contradicts himself. Why is that? It seems that in some passages, Maximus is purely philosophical, but in other more argumentative passages, Maximus is also rhetorical in his exposition. For example, here he says, other way of approach, argument D, the fourth argument, moreover, if every contraction, expansion, and section cutting for me is characteristic of the bodies, and if that which is free of every contraction, expansion, and section of any kind is necessarily incorporeal, then the soul is incorporeal, since it is totally insusceptible of all such realities. Now, the problem with this argument, in which Maximus very strictly correlates being corporeal, with having expansion and contraction, this is what interests us now, rather than Tomi section. Whereas incorporeal realities do not have contraction and expansion. In Ambiguum, in the 10th Ambiguum, section 35, as Constas divides them, he has the opposite argument. There, he speaks of the contraction and expansion of substance, quantity, and quality. Maximus understands there the expansion and contraction of substance as a downward and upward motion on an implicit Porphyrian tree, on a scale of the universals, from the most general to the most specific. So Maximus there asserts of the expansion and contraction of incorporeal, intelligible realities such as quality, substance, and quantity. Whereas here in Epistle 6, he argues that precisely because contraction, expansion, etc. are traits of corporeal bodily entities, and the soul does not suffer, if you'd like, from such realities, then it cannot possibly be corporeal. Now, the fifth argument is the main crux of the whole epistle, and it has many sub-arguments. He begins by saying that if every corporeal substance is divided into animate and inanimate, and if the soul is a body, it will then either be animate or inanimate. But if it is inanimate, it will be animate through an animating principle, either as a substance or a power, an accident, simply because. But if the soul is animated, but to say that the soul is animated is totally laughable. Interestingly, this is a pun that works both in Greek and in Latin. Maximus says animated concerning the anima, and the Greek would be alpimen emψυχον, δια ψυχούσης πάντως η ουσίας η δυνάμεως, ή της ευεβικότος ψυχοθήσεται. Ψυχήν δε ψυχούσαστε λέγειν, to claim that the soul is ensouled, as it were, would be as ridiculous as to say that the light is being illuminated, phosphotizeste, ή θερμαίνεστε το πυρ, or fire warmed, etc., which is utterly laughable, as he says, in a non-politically correct, in today's context, comment, etc. If we say that it is a substance that animates the body, again, we will be forced to define it either as a body or as incorporeal. If we say that it is a power, dynamis. So one by one, he attacks those potential counter-arguments. And of course, he also cites the difference between being governed and governing. That is, the soul governs the body, and claiming that the soul itself is bodily, corporeal, material, changes this relationship of power, being governed, archeste, archin ke archest. And he also connects this whole problematic with the question of sense perception and senses. He says, and if we say that the soul is an inanimate body, it will be bereft of senses, imagination, reason, and intellection. But all these exist and are seen around the soul and inside it, in contrast to a body seen as an isolated entity. Therefore, the soul is not a body. What is interesting in all of that here is that by definition, Maximus has to enforce a very strict dichotomy between soul and body, which is uncharacteristic of how he sees the soul and the body in other works, in which he speaks of the togetherness of soul and body, of the human hypostasis and prosopon and person as being both body and soul, of the body itself not simply being a thing after death, with only the soul being the person, but still after death and prior to the resurrection, of both body and soul comprising the person in a unity that cannot be born. But here, by definition, in order to precisely argue in favor of the incorporeality of the soul vis-a-vis the body, he makes this dichotomy. That is why the nature of these epistles is also important. If that other text, which is pseudonymous, it is not by Maximus, De Anima, was indeed by Maximus, where one sees a very strict dichotomy, a very a too Neoplatonic, if I may put it thusly, dichotomy of body and soul, the context is very different than Maximus simply responding to the question on the incorporeality of the soul, where such a dichotomy in the way of argumentation is natural, etc. So, in the one hand, although the arguments are not antithetical in those two texts, the context here is important. Anyway, there is also an interesting argument. The argument in general goes on in a similar vein, but there's an interesting passage in which Maximus attacks those that are afraid to ascribe incorporeality to the soul, because according to them, only God can be fully incorporeal, in quite a Manichaean dichotomy. To this, Maximus retorts with quite an analogical perspective. Maximus writes, and if they do not deign to say that the soul is incorporeal due to the fact that they define the divine as incorporeal, having an inexistent fear, which is due to the fact that they do not wish to make the soul equal to God, then they should equally exclude from us all the rest that we do have through participation to God. Their rationality would then reach its peak, because either we are defined by some qualities which are given or transferred to us by God, who is operating them, or inversely, God is named after us. And he gives a number of examples. Being, living, receiving light, becoming good, reasoning, thinking, etc. All these things, Maximus says, can be ascribed to God as well, albeit in an epiphanical way. Yet this is not to mean that we are to be deprived of such qualities in an analogical way as well. He writes, I mean attributes such as being, living, receiving light, becoming good, reasoning, thinking. We are defined by some of them due to our essence, and by some of them due to our movement, our economic will and our disposition, since we are defined as being, living, etc., etc. And we define God in a similar way as being, living, light, good, intellect, and logos, reason. Either we are all these things and we are defined by them because we derive them from their cause, or inversely because we operate them, thus defining the divine after what's proper to us. And Maximus continues by saying that you cannot divide these two things. You cannot either not say that God is living or light, albeit in an apophatic way, and ascribe these to us. And inversely, you cannot say that we do not live, etc., etc., that we do not have reason or intellect, because these are also properties that we ascribe to God to the extent that we ascribe to them. Not by comparison, as he says, nor by synonymia, as is the case with entities having the same essence, homoousia, which is not the case, obviously, with us and God, but by homonymy, homonymia, not synonymia, synonymy, homonymy, and if one can say, by participation, since these realities are infinitely away the one from the other in their nature, even if it would be more preferable to say that the divine is above nature and reality. Of course, always with the apophatic clause, even if it is more preferable to say that the divine is above nature and reality. So, while speaking about the incorporeality of the soul, Maximus engages in this analogical perspective in a very clear and, if I may say so, interesting way. So this balance between a full apophaticism and an analogy by participation is finds the chance to emerge, to be disclosed in Maximus's thinking in this passage, which is part of the fifth argument, of the longish fifth argument in the sixth epistle. Another argument, another case in which Maximus strays off the main subject concerns that about tropy, change, mutation, which comes immediately thereafter and is practically the penultimate actual part of the argument of Maximus. Here, I will not read it. I'll just say 2 sentences by it. The change mutation, this is Maximus speaking, does not belong to the essence of the soul, as I think, because if it did, then the soul would change infinite times and would not remain the same in its essence. The change or mutation, tropy, belongs to the movement which is dependent on us as a concomitant of the self-governing will. But those who have an opposite view claim that even the perpetual movement of the soul around God has a capacity of change, mutation, tropy. But I think that such a view is not true, and he continues on tropy. Here, Maximus considers that the soul possesses by its nature a certain movement, which is also aikinisia peri to kalon, ever movement around, perpetual movement around the good, but not of tropy, not of change, mutation. The latter is an unnatural movement, an infirmity and decay of operations according to nature. As says, ασθένεια και έκπτωση των καταφύσιν ενεργειών. Now, in Maximus's context, movement is a natural attribute and an indispensable step for the completion of the existence in rest, in stasis. On the contrary, the tropy, and that hence why Maximus does not ascribe it to the essence of the soul, although also an inherent element of the created being, is considered rather as an aspect, as a threatening aspect in a certain sense. So tropy in particular. In this epistle, we find a definition of tropy from the perspective of its eschatological exclusion. The tropy, Maximus explains, concerns the movement of the soul and not its essence. It is then an unnatural movement, a movement contrary to nature in a sense, equal to a failure and a weakness and decay of operations according to virtue. To nature, sorry, ασθένεια και έκπτωση των καταφύσιν ενεργειών. Now, here an aikinisia again is mentioned, and this concerns a psychic condition. For example, the perpetual movement of the soul around the good is considered a natural activity, not a super hyperphysin natural activity, since it is deemed natural for the soul to move toward the cause for which and because of which it was created. The interesting thing here is that Maximus does not wish, returning to the overall subject of body and soul, does not wish to abandon the idea of a radical heterogeneity between the body and soul, which would be expressed also in their respective modes of genesis. But apart from certain aspects of this epistle, certain passages where Maximus very clearly expounds a signature Maximian view of things, he treats the whole subject more as a theologumenon than a doctrine. And one can see that clearly in the final paragraph of the epistle. Maximus says, «Ταύτα μένουν ζητικός, αλλ' ου δογματικός παρημονηριστο». Maximus, sorry, let me find the translation because I... Yes, «Ταύτα ουν ζητητικός», all of the above could be stated in a manner of investigation instead of dogmatism. We find in Maximus this very interesting expression, ζητητικός αλλ' ου δογματικός, by which he wants to mean that he's dealing with a difficult and open theological question, for the solution of which he wishes to experiment with a diversity of different solutions. In these cases, because it's not only in epistle here, that in the epistle 6 that this can be traced, Maximus does not feel the certainty that he has when, for example, he combats theological views, which he considers to be obvious continuations of ancient heresies, etc. For example, when Maximus counters not in the epistle 6, when Maximus counters the notion that the soul pre-existed the body, there it is not the zititikos alou dogmatikos, that it is very clearly that Maximus expounds what he understands as orthodox doctrine, as the truth, the witness and the truth of the church. In other more obscure or ambiguous, no pun intended, aspects, he mentions a phrases such as zititikos, after all this zititikos alou dogmatikos. And this is the case here in a manner of investigation rather than dogmatism. And that is why perhaps one can see certain ways of argumentation that run contrary to other arguments on other subjects by Maximus, such as the aforementioned question of the expansion and contraction of intelligible realities as we find it asserted in Ambiguum 10, but denied here in these in what is incorporeal and by extension intelligible. I apologize for my haste in delivering the paper, but it's special circumstances. Sorry for that. Nobody has rung the bell, so I can presumably be here for one question, if that's possible.
Yes, this of course. Thank you very much for
your
paper. That was very good. Now we are still in the same subject. Questions? Well, I'll just short. It's a question, but it's a comment. I was also a bit surprised when I was reading Epistle 6. It looked to me like that he's repeating what Father Alexander said, well, already known things which you can find earlier and then. But at certain point, it seems to me you kind of started to challenge the authorship. Or on the basis of challenging authorships, you also mentioned that the anima, on the soul, can also be attributed to him.
I did not question the authenticity of the epistle, of Epistle 6.
No.
But of the anima, because the thing with the anima is that, for example, it is in Thesaurus Lingua Graecae, as Maximus's work. So every aspiring student or scholar of Maximus sees that and immediately thinks that, you know, this is by Maximus. Although there is this Francesco Celia, journal article, which very convincingly argues to the contrary. And if I may say so, this was part of what I tried to persuade you all about. Context is important. I cannot imagine Maximus writing a small treatise on the soul. You know, now I am Maximus the Confessor, and I will teach you things about the soul, you know, under this title, under this rubric. That would be so dichotomous, the body and soul dichotomy. Because this runs contrary to many other aspects of Maximus's theology concerning the hypostatic union, if you'd like, of body and soul in the human hypostasis. But here, the context is very different. Maximus is being asked, and he responds zititikos alou dogmatikos, in a way of investigation rather than in a doctrinal utterance, on a very particular issue. So, how should I put it? I am very happy that it has been proven that the anima is not by Maximus, in spite of the fact that many individual points to be found therein are also to be found in texts like Epistle 6. Obviously, the soul is ουσία, σώματος, νοερά, ενσώματη, πολιτευομένη, and all these expressions one can find in the anima, which indeed ring true in Maximus's context. But the problem is the wider rubric and how this attacks Maximus's theology, were that text to be true.
Okay, we have a question from Alex. Alex, please.
It's rather a comment. My connection may not work. Just a little remark. I was thinking, are you aware there was a huge debate between Thomas Aquinas and Buridan about the materiality of the soul, and that's it will be interesting to find out if there is any sort of connection back to Maximus's argument. It's just by way of a little footnote.
I'll have to check after the conference. I'm not that well versed in that particular debate.
It's just for fun. I mean, it's just an interesting addition to the topic. I mean,
I'll keep that. That would be an interesting paper, by the way, comparing these two. I'm afraid that any minute I'll have people storming in my office. So thank you immensely for your understanding.
Thank you very much, Sotiris, for your time and your paper, and hopefully we'll have the translation of the Epistle 6 by Dionysius published soon.
And every epistle, hopefully, every epistle by Maximus.
Good. Now
I'll be with you, although muted, as long as it's possible. So
thank you. Well, we move further on. The last, but it was not meant to be lost, but it's lost, and I think it is coming like the cherry on the cake. It's Luis Sales' presentation, which gives you a completely different, because this is the debate we started this morning with Bronwyn Neal about again, Syriac or Constantinopolitan life. Luis Sales, professor in California, teaching in Claremont, who wrote a thesis on the subject of among other things, on Maximus' African origin. He will present his paper on Maximus the Confessor, African Letters, key evidence in determining his origin. Luis, please take your floor.
Thank you. I'm all the way in California, so can everybody hear me all right? Is it coming through? Okay, great. Yeah. All right, thank you everybody for being here at the end. It's the morning for me, but it's evening for all of you, so let's get this done. As this audience likely knows, there remains considerable controversy about Maximus's origins. On the one hand, we have the traditional Greek life, which places him in Constantinople. On the other, the Syriac life, which places him in Palestine. Significant objections have been successfully raised against both accounts, and I simply want to ask here, what if the reason so many objections can be raised to both accounts is because both of them are wrong? In a previous publication, I have already raised the extensive problems with the Syriac life and the Palestinian origin narrative. Simply put, I argue that the Syriac life relies on extensive fabrications that are mainly humorous, not historical, to retell Maximus's early origins, that these details cannot be trusted for historical reconstruction purposes. Conversely, I regard the Greek life as sufficiently debunked at this point that it hardly needs consideration. But if so, we are faced with the obvious question. So where then was Maximus from? Of course, there remains a possibility he could have been from Palestine, and I believe that today that is the most accepted narrative among Maximian scholars. But I'm unconvinced that the Palestinian account is the most convincing on historiographical grounds. My method here is simply to follow Occam's razor. The account that makes the most sense of the most data tends to be the best account. So what account makes the most sense of the majority of the data? What explanation? It is what I would call Maximus's Alexandrian origin thesis. Flowers, Jankowiak, and Booth have already suggested that Maximus may have spent some time in Alexandria in the company of Sophronios and Ioannis Moschos, and that he perhaps even retreated westward with them as the Persians advanced on Egypt between 619 and 621. Further, Bourguignon has more extensively traced Maximus's correspondence with high-ranking officials that tends to gravitate toward Alexandria. But we should note further that a quantitative and qualitative comparison of Maximus's correspondence indicates a far stronger and deeper connection with Alexandria, Libya, and North Africa than with any other geopolitical scene. Maximus corresponded at most with two Constantinopolitans, Ioannis de Cubicularios and Constantinos de Sacellarios, and Ioannis was not actually a Constantinopolitan, he was moved there from elsewhere. And we should add that several of the confessor's letters addressed to the former were also concerned with issues unfolding in the Northern African corridor, such as epistles 12, 44, and 45. Similarly, Maximus's only correspondents from Palestine were Sophronius of Jerusalem, Theodosios of Gangra, and Stephanos of Dora. But these last two were much later acquaintances and cannot be taken at all as evidence of an early Palestinian connection. Simply put, Maximus's epistolary exchanges do Palestinian or Constantinopolitan origin narratives no favors. By contrast, Maximus' correspondence with Alexandrians, particularly and figures from the Northern African corridor more broadly, is overwhelming. We can confirm with certainty that some 20 of his works, including his most voluminous text, the Responses to Thalassios, were addressed to people from this geographical seaboard, and most of them were Alexandrians. To these figures, we may entertain in adding another figure of likely Alexandrian origin. Theocharistos seems to be the recipient of Maximus's Mystagogia, and it is possible that this is the same Theocharistos that bore an urgent letter from Maximus to Constantinople in behalf of the prefect George. Indeed, Jankowiak and Booth have both suggested that Theocharistos was on the same ship with George the prefect as they departed for Constantinople. From this perspective, Alexandria remained Maximus's center of activities, and the Northern African corridor, and eventually the Mediterranean to the north, his sphere of extended influence. But more importantly, situating Maximus in Alexandria from an early stage and tracing his movements across the Northern African corridor actually decreases historical triangulation problems and minimizes the number of explanatory principles needed to account for all of the data that we do possess. By this account, Maximus was born in 580, possibly to a wealthy family from Alexandria, if we take his social networks as an indication of his provenance and status. His friendships there are multidimensional and are not limited to clergy and ascetics, but also include scholars and politicians, among others. I would stress that this much is true of no other location. Further, most of his personal involvement in controversies concerned figures and disputes proper to the Northern African corridor, which again suggests his rootedness in that geopolitical scene. One thinks of a Chalcedonian and the demographic minority who regularly rubbed shoulders with Miaphysitic Egyptians. He most likely studied philosophy under David of Alexandria, probably as a late teenager or in his early 20s. David was a Christian commentator on the Aristotelian Platonic tradition who studied, perhaps, in fact, likely, beside Stephanos of Alexandria under Olympiadoros, who died in 570. David was active in the last quarter of the 6th century and perhaps into the early 7th century, which comfortably fits with the confessor's probable intellectual timeline. Evidence of Maximus's studies under David are contained in a document known as Additamentum 34, a set of notes on David's lectures on Porphyrios' introduction and Aristotle's categories. The manuscript tradition attributes the notes to Maximus, and the editor, Bram Rusin, affirms, as do others, the authenticity of the attribution. These notes, however, have failed to figure prominently in debates about Maximus's biography, despite the fact that they otherwise seem consistent with his timeline and everything we know about the philosophical apparatus of his works. In effect, chronologically, the confessor and David overlapped precisely when Maximus would have been engaged in his preparatory philosophical studies. These notes are also highly consistent with the confessor's thoroughgoing fluency in philosophical terminology, especially that traceable to Aristotle and his specifically Alexandrian commentators. On this point, it is odd that scholars readily affirm Maximus's Palestinian origin due to his quote-unquote originist concerns, something I frankly find overbloated since he only really addresses that in a few works and only very briefly. But discard a document that signals the confessor's actual physical presence in Alexandria, absorbing a philosophical tradition and terminology that is everywhere apparent in his works. Indeed, Gregory of Rashaina, the author of the Syriac Life, bitterly remarked that Maximus was highly skilled in sophistic discourse, contextually a likely reference to his use of Aristotelian syllogistics and doctrinal disputes. It is therefore very likely that we can already situate Maximus in Alexandria by the end of the 6th century, some 2 decades earlier than Bourdignon's chronology allows, without engendering historical triangulation problems. Either way, further evidence corroborates Maximus' implication with the philosophical circles of Alexandria. Maximus addressed the responses to Theopemptos, for example, to Theopemptos the Alexandrian Scholasticos. The confessor would later rely on him to deliver an important letter to certain implacable nuns in Alexandria. Similarly, Epistle 17 is addressed to Iulianos Scholasticos and is concerned with elucidating the incarnation from a Chalcedonian perspective. Maximus expressly identifies this Iulianos as an Alexandrian, Alexandria, and also references a second addressee, Christopemptos Scholasticos, also an Alexandrian. The two Scholastiki clearly regarded Maximus with respect and trusted him to relay their messages, syllabas, to the Alexandrian prefect. During or soon after Maximus' studies under David, Sophronius and Ioannis Moschos fled to Alexandria in the face of the Persian advance and arrived in the city probably between 603 and 605. While there, they made a number of important acquaintances, as is well known. Scholars have devoted much attention, for example, to their certainly relevant connection with the Patriarch Ioannis the Almsgiver, who was the Patriarch from 610 to 620. But more significant for our purposes is their connection to Stephanos of Alexandria, whom they expressly mention. If Maximus studied under David of Alexandria a few years earlier, or even at this time, it is possible that he could have met Sophronios, perhaps Ioannis as well, between 603 and 605, particularly given David's likely academic relationship with Stephanos. They were friends, they studied together. Placing the fateful meeting of Maximus and Sophronios this early in Alexandria results in a shifted, but in fact more plausible, sequence of events that efficiently accounts for a series of subsequent associations more neatly than the alternatives. A figure that plays a key role here is actually Anastasios, the former imperial notarios and Maximus's lifelong partner, disciple. These two met between 617 and 618, most likely, almost certainly, in Alexandria, or if not in the northern African corridor, but Alexandria is the most likely possibility. The date of 617 or 618 matters because Anastasios had previously been the notarios to Emperor Constantius II's grandmother, and as a disciple of such standing, he would ostensibly seek an eminent monastic teacher. If Maximus had only met Sophronius for the first time between 614 and 617, as Polignon had suggested, an alternative theory that explains Maximus's turn from philosophical to monastic interests must be offered to account for Anastasius' trust in Maximus at an early stage of his own monastic career. The more efficient solution is to suppose that Maximus and Sophronios met toward the beginning of the 7th century and not nearly 2 decades later, in all likelihood at this point, starting Maximus' monastic career. At that point, he would be almost 20 years a monk when he took Anastasius under his wing rather than a few years. Assuming that Maximus and Sophronius had met soon after the turn of the century, it is possible to concur with Jankowiak and Booth's suggestion that Maximus may have fled Alexandria along with Sophronius around 619 as its fall to the Persians became apparent. If so, Maximus would have likely spent a number of years in the company of Sophronius on several islands, including Crete and Cyprus, where Maximus met several figures who would later receive letters from him. Again, this way we account for some additional connections. During this time, Maximus remained in touch with his former acquaintances from the northern African corridor, among them Thalassisos, the Libyan eagleman, who received several letters in Maximus's longest work, of course, the responses to Thalassios, and thus also Theocharistos, the recipient of the Mystagogia. This was Maximus' most productive period, which lasted until around 632. Around this time, we find him in Carthage with a relatively dry quill, which may be explained by triangulating, once again, a peculiar set of epistolary exchanges. By Jankowiak and Booth stating, Maximus sent a letter to Peer Illustris, Epistle 13, between 629 and 633, that refuted Severan doctrines. Peter was at the time stationed in Alexandria, and toward the end of his correspondence, Maximus complains of his lack of access to books. This is unsurprising, since he points out that, quote, "You have my blessed master, father, and teacher, Lord Abba Sophronios, who has become wealthy in a wealth of divine books there with you," unquote. It is tempting to link both events here. Maximus' dearth of sources was a direct result of his teacher's departure. I would propose that the confessor sent Epistle 13 somewhere in late 631 or early 632, because by the summer of 632, Maximus had addressed a letter to Sophronius himself, Epistle 8, that expressed his desire to come to him. It is clear from this letter that their parting was a very recent affair, and that Maximus is eager to rejoin his teacher, who was already in Alexandria. Further, around 633, the confessor addressed Alexandrian deacon Cosmas a letter, Epistle 15, that is notable for its extensive use of sources, something impossible the year before, despite addressing a figure of much higher political standing and who would therefore expect a much more profuse answer. At this point, Maximus may have rejoined his teacher in Alexandria, which we can perhaps corroborate with Opuscule 12. This letter to Cosmas must have been written on the eve of the Unionist Council of Alexandria, which was held June 3rd of 633. Maximus and Sophronius were together, as attested by the first event after the 40-year lacuna that we find in the Syriac anti-life, right? It jumps from Maximus being 10 years old to being 50 years old, and inexplicably, and with nothing in between. Some suppose that the Syriac anti-life situates Sophronius and Maximus together in Palestine around this time, but the Syriac never actually says that. What the text does indicate is Maximus' prominent skill in argumentation in a context that seems most consistent with the eve of the Unionist Council of Alexandria, perhaps with the council itself, although this is a bit hard to ascertain. Some people have raised objections to this suggestion by saying that there's no way Gregory would have been at this council. I would respond that Gregory was himself present during this time, and we know that he also attended the far more geographically distant Council of Cyprus in 636. He specifically tells us that. So this is good indication that he was inclined to attend these theological soirees. As a bishop, he probably would have been required to. The sequence of events I have proposed is consistent with the evidence. It also addresses a number of perennial biographical questions about Maximus and his acquaintances that have otherwise remained elusive. Following Sophronius' elevation to the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, late in 634, Maximus assumed a central role in the unfolding Northern African corridor's theopolitical matrix of power. One of his most important contacts was Peter Illustris, who likely died between 651 and 652, who was an African patrician. While it is impossible to determine where they met, Carthage between 629 and 631 is probable. We can infer from the written exchanges that Peter often sought Maximus's advice, and the confessor was reminded during his trial several decades later of his own influence on Peter's decisions. In all, Maximus addressed him 4 documents: Epistles 13-14, Opuscule 12, and the Computus Ecclesiasticus. One of the common threads that runs through these works is the effort to marshal support for the Chalcedonian factions spread across the Northern African corridor by means of Peter's political clout. To that effect, the confessor often made admittedly bold requests. For instance, Epistle 14 was delivered by one of his other non-correspondents, the Alexandrian deacon Cosmas, with the strategic request that his clerical friend be reinstated by the Pope, Kyros of Alexandria, the Alexandrian Pope, so to perform his ecclesiastical duties. Bolder yet, perhaps, is Opuscule 12, in which the confessor argues that the former Constantinopolitan Patriarch Pyrrhos's honorifics should be withheld in liturgy, given that he had been excommunicated by other patriarchal sees. Finally, it is tantalizing to interpret Maximus's vehement defense of the Alexandrian dating system in the Computus Ecclesiasticus as indicative of his own Alexandrian providence. This consideration of the evidence indicates a long-standing connection with a rich social network of prominent and also lesser-known figures that cluster in Alexandria and spread outward, primarily west, not east, across the Northern African corridor. Maximus's relation to George the Eparch offers another angle to texture the confessor's investments in the internal affairs of the Northern African seabed. While Maximus only sent one letter, Epistle 1, to him, the scarcity of his correspondence with the Eparch is precisely evidence of how close he was to him. Why send him a letter when he's right next to him? This fact is indirectly corroborated by other letters, in fact. We may recall that Maximus personally delivered the message of Julianus Scholasticos from Epistle 17 to George. But their close connection is indicated further by Epistle 18, where Maximus addresses Alexandrian nuns in the name of George. Relatedly, Maximus advises the Igumeni Iania, also of Alexandria, to admit a nun to her monastery, despite having once embraced Miaphysitism. This is Epistle 11. In all these affairs, Maximus functioned as the theological representative of arguably the most powerful man on the Roman-occupied continent. Much of the scholarship on Maximus has attempted to explain Maximus' connections with 2 mid-level Constantinopolitan bureaucrats, but far more imposing is the degree of theopolitical clout he obtained by virtue of his long-standing and intimate ties with the Roman potentates on the African continent. These connections offer significant data points of Maximus' social networks in Alexandria and his recurring concerns, not with Constantinople or with Palestine, but with Alexandria and the Northern Corridor itself. The Greek and Syriac lives fail efficiently to account for these social dimensions. The Palestinian origin especially cannot produce any correspondence that would indicate Maximus' sustained early presence here. I would underscore this. He literally never writes to anyone from Palestine that he would have met in his early life other than Sophronius, and neither of them is in Palestine at the time. As the affair with the Alexandrian nuns we met in Epistle 18 grew more complex, Maximus addressed Ioannis Cubicularius a detailed letter about the unfolding events. This is Epistle 12. This, again, is better indication of his Alexandrian concerns than of his Constantinopolitanism, as has been often interpreted. When George arrested some recalcitrant nuns, the Patricia Martina ordered their release, but he flatly ignored her with the excuse that the letter was a forgery. Unfortunately for George, it wasn't. Predictably, George was summoned to the capital to explain himself, while Maximus sent him Epistle 1 to comfort him. As matters soured for George, the confessor addressed Epistles 44 and 45 to Ioannis Cubicularios, whom he reprimands in the latter letter for seemingly ignoring him. Similarly, he sent an urgent letter, Epistle B, to a certain Stephanos, recently also arrived in Constantinople, to make sure there were no confusions regarding the letters he had addressed to Ioannis. It appears Maximus sent this urgent message through Theocharistos, formerly the recipient of the Mystagogia, so it would seem from these exigencies that the letter was also an Alexandrian connection. During this ordeal, Maximus responded in Epistle 16 to the Alexandrian deacon Cosmas, commended to Peter Numidia in Epistle 14, who had tried to assuage the confessor's nerves following George's departure. Whatever Cosmas' communication may have said, it indicates that Maximus' bond to George was significant, deep, and long-standing, and that others in Alexandria were appraised of the unfolding events and their importance for the confessor. After George's fall from power, Maximus increasingly retreated westward, away from the Arab advances. When Alexandria fell in 641, Maximus was already farther west, likely in Carthage, where we find him promoting the Neo-Chalcedonian cause against the deposed Constantinopolitan Patriarch Pyrrhos in July of 645. In 646, Maximus left Africa Proconsularis, never to return, and sailed to Rome. 1 year later, Abdallah ibn Sa'd invaded the Exarchate of Africa and decisively defeated the Exarch Gregory at a battle near Sufetula, a city within an unnervingly short 6-day march of Carthage. Hereafter, Maximus put his faith in Rome and played an instrumental role in the Lateran Council of 649. His maneuvers were noted by the Constantinopolitan authorities, who subsequently arrested, tried, and twice exiled him before convening the third trial that ruled against him, condemning him to lose his tongue and right hand at the age of 82. After his brutal mutilation, he was sent into exile to Lazica, where he died on August 13, 662. In her entry on the life and times of Maximus the Confessor in the Oxford Handbook, Pauline Allen writes, quote, "Telling against Maximus's Constantinopolitan provenance is the fact that his philosophical position, especially with regard to Neoplatonism, links him more readily to the Alexandrian rather than to the Constantinopolitan tradition, while his responses to Origenism make more sense in the context of Palestinian monasticism, where the Origenist controversy had raged in the 6th century. A Palestinian connection also explains more readily Maximus' relationship with the circle of John Moschus and Sophronius. Conversely, Palestinian origin makes it more difficult to credit Maximus' relationships with high-profile officials of the court in Constantinople and elsewhere in the Byzantine world, such as Peter Illustris and George, the part of Africa. This has to be explained away by speculating a brief sojourn in Constantinople," unquote. Allen's words offer an excellent summary of the impasse scholars face when attempting to reconcile the claims made by the Greek and Syriac lives concerning Maximus' early years. This paper has attempted to address this impasse by suggesting that an early Alexandrian origin narrative deserves further consideration. This thesis differs from the Constantinopolitan and Palestinian origin narratives in that it does not rely on any quasi-biographical account. Rather, it focuses on reliable evidence. In my estimation, the Alexandrian origin thesis offers a heavily revised look at Maximus's origins that shifts the focus to his possible Alexandrian provenance and to his ongoing engagement in the geopolitical stage of what I have called the Northern African corridor. If the Palestinian and Constantinopolitan accounts are to be believed, scholars have yet to articulate a single linear narrative that satisfies historiographical principles better than the Alexandrian origin thesis I have proposed, especially in accounting for the most data in the most efficient way. Accordingly, I believe that future engagement with Maximus' origin and intellectual productions could benefit from being more intentional in foregrounding the possibility that the so-called Aquinas of the East may in fact have been an Alexandrian. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luis. It's really great thing. Now we have something more kind of more fundamental, which actually gives the answer why Maximus himself said that he never been in Palestine. And okay, I open the floor for questions. If there is, well, probably I'll have one question regarding to Stephanus. What kind of relationship to Stephanus? Probably he was then with Stephanus in Alexandria. He actually developed a friendship with Stephanus, and it's possible that Stephanus is a relationship to Constantinopolitan court.
It's possible, but the thing that my kind of hesitance about Constantinople is, I have a feeling that it's the Maximus' connection to Constantinople geographically gets established, as I said, on the basis of two figures, right? The Sacellarios and the Cubicularios. And the thing is that we don't know anything about where the Sacellarios was from. But we do know that Ioannis Cubicularios was actually not from Constantinople. He was stationed elsewhere, because in one of his letters to him, Maximus mentions, he congratulates him on being moved to Constantinople, which means he already knows him before he's there. And so he could have connections in Constantinople through Stephanos, possibly. I think that's another possibility. But that one requires, I think, more speculation. Whereas it's likely that Maximus had already met Ioannis before his station in Constantinople. The question is where? Who knows? We just don't have evidence for that.
But you reject a possibility that he was at the court, official at the court in Constantinople.
Yeah. I don't think that's the reason that we've kind of believed that for a while is because the third recension of the Greek life, which is the only one that has the infancy narrative, right? It says that he was the protosikritis of Heraclius. But the problem with that, and this goes back to some Wolfgang Lachner's articles from the 60s and 70s, the problem with that is that position didn't exist until a century later, right? And that early Greek narrative is actually a plagiarism of the life of Theodore the Studite, almost word for word. And it has a number of other problems, like Maximus leaving 3 years after his appointment, right? It says he was appointed in 610 and he leaves in 613 because of the Monenergis controversy. It was like, that wouldn't happen for another 20 years. And so it's extremely unlikely that Maximus was in Constantinople as a court official, as the Greek life says. Again, the main objection would simply be, well, this is just based on a Greek account that is itself kind of, light plagiarism of the life of Theodore the Studite. We don't have any other indication anywhere in Maximus' letters or anything to suggest that he was a politician at any point or that he was in the court.
Good. Father Alexander, you had a question or? No, okay, I thought that, okay, more questions? Oh, I have to admit, Alex.
Alex.
Sorry, it's just in a purely speculative way. What do you think? What kind of evidence could tip the balance? Because it's still a very good hypothesis against two lives. I would be very happy if we could accept that, but there is a grain of something, and I'm just trying to think what sort of evidence could be added to the balance.
I mean, I think for me, it's simply a matter of historiographical methodology, right? When we need to, like, when you're pressed to a wall and asked, what is the most convincing, right? What is the most likely account? And we're talking about likely, we're not talking about certain. This is 14 centuries ago. We're not going to get certain for a lot of this stuff. You usually prioritize the accounts that make the most sense of the most data in the most efficient way. When you look at the attempts to legitimate the Palestinian or the Constantinopolitan accounts, there's millions of objections that get raised, and each one of them has to be kind of addressed with a speculation. The Alexandrian origin account doesn't have any speculation to it. It's just based on, we have letters, we have documents that people have discarded for a long time under the assumption, oh, well, we know that he wasn't in Alexandria because we know he was in Palestine, or we know he was in Constantinople, but we don't know that he was. We don't know that he was in Constantinople, and we don't know that he was in Palestine. But we do have a document that seems quite plausible. I mean, we've all read Maximus. He sounds like an Alexandrian philosopher. He uses the categories of Aristotle. He uses Porphyry's philosophy all the time. We're not, the attribution of Additamentum 34 to Maximus is not implausible. If he never used, Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy and were some kind of desert hermit who never knew about them, and that were attributed to him, okay, that'd be one thing. But we all know how thoroughly he uses the Aristotelian apparatus. And that would place him in Alexandria at the end of the 6th century, which makes sense. He would be like 18, 20 years old, studying philosophy exactly like anybody else of a relatively decent income would have been. And we see that throughout his works. So for me, it's a matter of likelihood, right? And the most likely case is he's in Alexandria. He's born in Alexandria, raised in Alexandria. It doesn't, I have considered literally all the evidence I possibly can. And it's the one that has the fewest problems. I don't have to kind of postulate all that many kind of additional explanatory principles. I can just propose a pretty linear account that actually doesn't really create many problems. It solves a lot of problems. The only objections I've seen raised to this argument is to say that there is, for example, in the Lateran Council, there's a signature of somebody who has the name Maximus and is from the Great Lavra. Well, but there's 6 people who are signatories of that document called Maximus. It's an extremely common name. How do we know that it's Maximus the Confessor? We don't. It's just an assumption that it is, but we don't know that. So, and again, I would ask the question, if he is from Palestine, why does he really never write home to anybody? Like literally no one. The only people he writes are significantly later connections that he makes through councils elsewhere. Like those are, and he's writing to them in the 640s and 650s, right? Those are not relevant connections. So Sophronius is the only one, and he only writes in one letter. And again, I think that if you, the fact that he writes him so few letters is a good indication that he actually spends quite a lot of time with him, which again explains a lot in terms of his intimate connection with Sophronius. That's my sense of the.
But that's argumentum ex silentio, and that's you see what I mean.
Well, I think that it's well from the point of view of philosophical background, I could easily locate him in Alexandrian school.
Oh yes, that would work perfectly. I fully agree.
And I don't think that anybody, he couldn't get this education elsewhere. And because it's not just education, but the writing, normally a kind of interpretation of Porphyry and Aristotle, that's just like a line of Alexandrian Neoplatonists.
Absolutely.
Of course, you can have Boethius, but he is also in this kind of, maybe he has also connection to Alexandria in some sense, but not.
Alex, I agree with you that it's an argument from silence, but I could flip it and say, well, show me the evidence. Show me the positive evidence to the contrary, right? Like, show me the evidence. Like, let me put it another way. Right, Maximus died 1400 years ago, and only in 2013 did somebody suggest that he might in fact really truly be from Palestine. And the basis for that was the Syriac life. If there were so much other evidence for that case, why did nobody suggest it before?
That's a good point. Yeah.
If there was so much convincing, right, like, whereas people did suggest that he was from Alexandria without there being any life, right? Boudinot was like, well, he must have spent a good while there. Jankowiak and Booth both, well, he must have spent some time in Alexandria. Again, for me, it's a matter of, let's put the evidence in the scales and see where things land. And I have no dogs in this fight, really. I mean, I don't think it makes a huge difference for me how I interpret Maximus. I already kind of interpret him internally anyway. But it's just a matter of you weigh the evidence and you say, I mean, it lays pretty heavily toward Alexandria, right? That's my sense.
Thank you.
No, thank you for the helpful comments and suggestions.
Thank you for your paper once more, and thank you all for your papers today. You all have invitation to contribute to the volume of Subsidia Maximiana. We will probably start editing it by the end of this year. I don't know. I will send you email with exact deadline, and then also with guidelines to prepare your manuscripts. I'm not just saying to those who presented their paper, but we have other a Maximian scholar like Daniel, and then Jeromang Mitro, and who actually attended the conference that didn't present. And they are also welcome, and we also have some other scholars. And then I think that the issue of letters is very important. We'll probably add more people to the volume, actually, to have covered more letters, because I think that like a letter 15, which is extremely important, I would say, is not really covered, and that also need to be open up and everything. Now, I will give a word to Alex. Alex, about because normally you know that we are going. 1 year is conference in Budapest, 1 year is conference in Belgrade. We have this kind of visiting each other, but we try to keep the conference with more people from different parts of the world. Of course, it's very difficult now to have people coming from California and coming from like Brisbane or Sydney to Belgrade and Budapest, and that's the way how we actually overarch these distances. And Alex and I, we talked earlier about the next conference in Budapest, but I'll just give a word to Alex to say a couple of words.
Thank you. There isn't actually much to say. We will certainly organize a conference in a year's time, and it will be the 5th conference in the series, so it would make sense to make it a little bit bigger splash. And until now, we've concentrated on one specific work of Maximus. And I think this really has worked out well, because we had very concentrated, focused attention to different aspects. But for now, by way of exception, maybe we could make we could choose a wider topic. And this is normally at the end of each conference, we discuss with all the participants, we discuss what should be the topic for the next conference. And I don't think we need a long discussion. What I suggest is that all of you think about it and send us the suggestions. The idea was to make what we've come up with so far was just to make it something like Maximus and type of conference, not focusing on one work, but saying, well, Maximus and Neoplatonism. But so far I have had 2 suggestions which might be interesting. Our colleague Miklos Nicholas Vasani suggested, but that's because that's his favorite topic, suggested Maximus and Dionysius the Areopagite. And for my part, I would suggest even wider topic, something like Maximus and the Bible, or Maximus and the Holy Scripture, because that opens the field to so many other topics, and that can sort of include all sorts of perspectives. But these are absolutely not guidelines. This is just an idea to suggest to you to think along those lines, and just then perhaps, if somebody has a brilliant idea, please raise the hand, and if not, then just write to us, and we decide in the coming months how to go. What you? Oh yes, I see Louis has an idea. Go ahead.
My suggestion, but maybe because that's what I work on, is Maximus and gender. This has been kind of boiling under the surface for a long time. It'd be great to have a symposium that actually kind of tries to figure it out, if we can.
Okay. Well, think it over.
Yeah, I think that it's very, very good topics, and there are more and more paper on this topic, because it's a very kind of original way of putting things you cannot find in earlier fathers, but I don't think that you can find in later fathers as well, that kind of approach.
Yes, we could all just as well say something like Maximus and the Hesychasts. I'm just sorry, just by way of thinking. Maybe one shouldn't think in sort of I mean, sort of naturally, I would think backwards in time, but one can just well think from Maximus onwards, and like Max. But that's yes. Thank you, Luis. That's an idea. I mean, why not? So that's pretty much what I've got to say. Really, please get your papers ready as soon as possible. We'll send you the guidelines, and do think of the next topics, because if we are perfectly open, and it's sort of more or less decided on the basis of feasibility and how many people might be interested, and what sort of conference we can create on the basis of a given topic.
Good. If there is no any more question, comments, suggestions, I would like to thank you all for your time. I know that's been difficult for some of you. Well, for me, I woke up at 4 o'clock to start from the beginning. Now I have to sleep a little bit after that. But thank you. I think that it was a very successful colloquium. We opened a lot of topics. We offer some solutions. Well, hopefully in the writing will be more elaborated, and we actually will produce one more volume on St. Maximus. Once more, thank you for your time, and I wish you all the best today on St. Maximus Day or Feast of St. Maximus.
Thank you for organizing.
Yes, thank you. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Father Alexander.
Yeah,
Father Alexander is on the spot. He's in Belgrade, and he's actually the host, the main host. I'm much more virtual host.
Okay. Okay.
Well done.
Okay. All the best then.
All the best. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye-bye.